Good evening, everyone. Once again, thank you for joining us here for this Thursday evening. Look into the Holy Book Devotional. I am your host, Charles Logan, wishing you a very good evening and hopefully some thoughts that will stay with you during the week. I hope that we're all getting in the mood for Christmas. It's a little difficult to get in the swing of things when daytime temperatures are in the 60s and 70s and 80s, and migratory birds come here for the winter to get away from freezing temperatures and blizzards in other places. The Southwest is a great place. Mild winters, no shoveling of snow, no real weather-related traffic problems. It's a place where people who can come here to get away from all that stuff. But it's true that many of us are misplaced from parts of the country where there was a nice definite change of seasons, and Christmas time meant snow and icicles and peeking out that window early in the morning to see newly fallen snow just literally glistening and sparkling in the moonlight. I miss Christmas in the snow and all those memories of those freezing temperatures, but the warmth of our little house, hot chocolate and cinnamon spice cider. But now, at this wise old age, there are other things that remind me of Christmas, and it's mostly the more spiritual than the material things now. My thoughts turn to the real meaning of the season, the Annunciation, the Advent, the visitations, and the birth of our Savior in a lowly manger. In my spiritual maturity, I hope, I have grown to appreciate all of the prophecy, preparation, and realization of prophecy come true that confirmed that the baby born in Bethlehem of Mary was the true Messiah, come at the fullness of time. Now, two of the most important books in the Old Testament that speak to the character of the Messiah and to the fullness of time in which he came to us are the books of Isaiah and Daniel. The book of Isaiah speaks of his suffering and rejection at the hands of his own people. And the book of Daniel speaks to the preparations made by God for the Christ child to be born at just the right time and under the right prophetic circumstances. In our time together this evening, I'll talk about the book of Daniel and how his interpretation of Nebuchadnezzar's dream prophesied the perfect fullness of time, as is the familiar phrase in Galatians 4:4, because it reads, "In the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law." We'll look at an example of how God's chosen people underwent a transition, not only in the way that they thought, but in the way that they worshipped and lived and even viewed the universe that they were a part of. The meaning of the 400 years of silence and the long road to Bethlehem. The northern kingdom of Israel had fallen to the Assyrians in the year 722 BC as God's judgment for their sinfulness and disobedience and tolerance of pagan worship. The southern kingdom, on the other hand, had survived through the efforts of the good king Hezekiah. For 136 years, the kingdom of Judah survived in relative peace and enjoying a certain amount of prosperity. The memory of the fall of the northern kingdom and the imminent threat to their own began to fade in their memory. The same people who had enjoyed God's saving grace forgot about how God had miraculously intervened to save them. The people began to slowly fall into the same lifestyle that was the downfall of their northern brethren. They began to turn away from their reliance on God, no longer listened to God's prophet, and began to enjoy the hedonistic lifestyle that so easily overtakes a people concerned only with their own indulgent pleasures, not to mention a succession of sinful kings. So what has this to do with the subject of our time together this evening, you might ask? Once their world was turned upside down. David's holy city was burned, Solomon's temple was destroyed, and the symbol of their faith, the Ark of the Covenant, was defiled and carried away. Their world as they had known it no longer existed. Where was Yahweh, the God of their fathers? There was no longer a central place where his spirit could reside, where the people could go to worship him. Not only that, but the ones that survived found themselves a captive people in a foreign pagan land. Their despair is recorded in Psalm 137:1, where it says, "By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion." Now the subject of our time together this evening is the 400 years of silence. A time in the history of the Hebrews when God did not talk to the people through his prophets. The chronological time period was probably from the end of the book of Malachi to the beginning of the New Testament, roughly 435 years. However, it was the prophecy of Daniel during the Babylonian captivity that lays the groundwork for the profound events that took place during the time that we call the 400 years of silence. The scriptures were silent, but God was working to prepare the world for the promised Messiah. In the fullness of time, if you will. Now here's the prophecy of Daniel that set the stage for the 400 years. Daniel 2:31 to 35, and we find it also in 7 to 17. And if you recall, it is the statue that King Nebuchadnezzar dreamed of, statue with the golden head and a breastplate of bronze and so on and so forth. Well, each one of those areas on the statue represented an empire. The empires that would play such an important role in the long road to Bethlehem. Now, Daniel was one of the elite of the population of Judah that Nebuchadnezzar had transported to Babylon to live in the royal household. Now, much of the population that had been carried to Babylon from Judah lived in clusters outside the city, the main city. In chapter 2, we're told that the king had a dream that none of his royal advisors could interpret, so he called on Daniel. The dream in Daniel's dream in chapter 7 prophesied many of the events that occurred during the 400 years of silence, and even beyond, into the events of the New Testament. So let's look at the king's dream and the dream that God gave to Daniel so that he could interpret Nebuchadnezzar's dream. So let's look at the meaning of the image of the statue that I had just mentioned. It is one of the most important stops along the journey to understanding the long road to Bethlehem. Nebuchadnezzar, we're told, was troubled by a dream he had. He told his court advisors not only to interpret the dream, but using their powers of divination to tell him the substance of the dream. And of course, they failed. He then turned to Daniel, who prayed to God for the ability to not only tell Nebuchadnezzar what the dream was, but to give him the meaning. God would speak to Daniel twice about the prophetic meaning of this dream, once in chapter 2 and again in chapter 7. The prophecy dealt with the four major kingdoms that would play a huge and major part in God's plan to bring forth the Messiah and usher in the new covenant. The statue's head was made of gold. This represented the Babylonian kingdom, its wealth and its power, yet its vulnerability because of others who would covet its wealth. The silver of the chest of the statue represented the Medo-Persian Empire, which would eventually bring an end to the Babylonian Empire. Now the brass thighs represented the Greek Macedonian Empire that would overcome the mighty Persian Empire. The iron legs was the Roman Empire. And finally, the iron and clay feet, the vulnerability of the Roman Empire and its eventual destruction by the stone or the Christian Revolution, which would extend over the entire world. And now, the events of the 400 years of silence. The term is certainly misleading in that Scripture is silent, yet God was ever present in the affairs of mankind, laying the history that would manifest his plan for the salvation of mankind. Here are the important events during the 400 years that brought about the new covenant and ushered in one of our most important holidays of the year. Number one, the defeat of the Babylonian Empire by the combined forces of the Medes and the Persians. This event paved the way for the Persian king Cyrus to issue the Edict of Reconciliation, which allowed the Jewish exiles to return to Jerusalem to rebuild the city and the temple. This would put God's people in a place wherein they would encounter Jesus and give them the opportunity first to hear the Messiah's message of salvation. And number two, the Macedonians under Alexander the Great would eventually conquer not only the Persian Empire, but most of the known world. Greek influence and language would become the lingua franca of the day. As we know, the writings that would eventually become the Bible were originally written in Greek and made available through the missionary work of Paul and the other apostles to the entire world. Now, the iron legs represented the Roman Empire, through whose engineering technology would build roads that would carry the message of the new covenant throughout the world. Finally, the stone would be cast against the pagan Roman Empire, and it would eventually succumb to the message of salvation brought by Jesus Christ and his small band of disciples, and allow and actually grow into the most significant movement that the world has ever seen. So now that we've seen the historical events of a time on which the Bible is mostly silent, what are the lessons that we take away from the events leading up to and including the silence of those 400 years? Number one, God is in control of man's history. Because he created it, he planned from the beginning the salvation of mankind, and he orchestrated the events that would prove and pave the way for man to exercise his free will to accept his message of truth. And number two, God will use the might of pagan cultures to work in concert for his plan to be manifest. And number 3, God will protect his people and he'll guide them through history. Many cultures and religions and empires have come and gone, but God's chosen people have prevailed, and his covenant community will continue to survive because he has promised it. And number 4, as a nation, we must learn from the mistakes and failures of God's own chosen people. While he is faithful to never turn his back on us, we're not immune to the consequences of our own sins. Now more than ever, in the life of our country, we need to turn to God. We need to acknowledge the sovereignty of Christ and to turn to him in our hour of need. As his covenant people, we need to lead the way to a new and powerful reawakening. Each time that we talk about the meaning of Christmas and the joy that it brings to most of us, we can't forget that this time of year is a very difficult time for some. Life and circumstances do not take a break at this time of year. Unanticipated crises will occur, and the joy of the season will be replaced by sadness and painful memories. It is at this time especially that we need to draw closer to the one who comforts us the most. When there is no one else who can understand the depth of our suffering, it is the time to put all of our trust in the one who took it upon himself, human form, so he could suffer and die and be able to understand our own suffering. There are so many things that this Christmas season brings to mind. The joy and happiness, the memories, family, love, and just to name a few. But let us not forget that our loving God has orchestrated our paths through this earthly journey, and that the joys and sadness that life brings to each of us. Let us not forget either how God, in his unconditional love for mankind, guided mankind through that long road to Bethlehem to bring about the fullness of time at the right time. Well, thank you once again for joining me, everyone, and I as I say, consider it a privilege to be able to share this time with you. So I pray that God will bless each and every one of you, and that you will have a safe and pleasant time until we are able to get together again next Thursday. Thank you for joining me. I am your host, Charles Logan, wishing you a good rest of the day and the week to come.